In this segment, we're going to use our discussion of the origins of war to understand the U.S. decision to join World War I on the side of Great Britain and France in April of 1917. Up until that point, the United States had sat on the sidelines of World War I, protecting its neutrality and its right to engage in trade with all of the participants. America's intervention, though, in 1917 fundamentally changed the course of World War I. So why did the United States completely reverse its foreign policy stance on the European war in April of 1917? Before turning to that, it's important to note that President Woodrow Wilson had long sought to keep the United States out of this war. He had campaigned on this, quote, foreign policy accomplishment in November of 1916. He even began to pressure the British and the French into accepting some type of compromise peace in the late 1916 by beginning to cut off American loans in the fall of 1916. He gave his famous Peace Without Victory speech in January of 1917, in which he alienated and depressed Great Britain and France and the publics in these respective countries by effectively refusing to take sides in that conflict. Wilson, though, had little choice but to reverse course in April of 1917 because the German military had opted to implement unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping in January of 1917. This meant that more American vessels were going to get sunk and more American citizens were going to die as a result of German actions. Wilson also learned in the spring of 1917 that Germany had initiated diplomatic conversations for an effective alliance with Mexico. You probably heard about this through something called the Zimmermann Telegram. Germany encouraged the Mexican government to launch an attack or foment a rebellion on the southern border of the United States. Germany then offered to support Mexico in any of its potential efforts to reclaim territory lost to the United States back in the middle of the 19th century. So why did the German government in effect make this horrible strategic calculation to attack the United States, which then brought the United States into the war and effectively tilted the balance of military power irrevocably against Germany?
So the German military felt that they had no other choice but to take these actions. They believed that the balance of resources were shifting against them as the American economy was continually replenishing the British and the French armies. They felt the United States would come into the war eventually, but they knew it would take months, even a year, before it could put sizable numbers of troops on the continent. Consequently, they hoped to undermine the British and French supply lines and force them into a peace before the American military could arrive. In sum, the first answer to why the U.S. entered World War I is because the Germans provoked it by attacking American shipping. The second answer gets us closer to Wilson's own political ambitions and Wilsonianism. Wilson had a vision for a new world order centered on the League of Nations. He also wanted to stamp out European imperialism more generally in the world. He knew this would dramatically undermine the power of European countries. He felt a tough peace settlement would accomplish these goals. He believed that his capacities to shape the peace settlement, though, would be limited unless the United States had shaped the war's outcome by fighting in it.
So the United States enters this war in 1917, but significant quantities of American troops don't arrive in Europe really until the summer of 1918. The Germans launch one last military offensive in 1918, fail, and then they opt to surrender. So how did U.S. entry shape the military and political consequences of World War I? So in military terms, the arrival of American troops, new access to American credit, and enhanced access to war material built by the American economy shifts the distribution of military power on the continent and pushes the German military to opt for peace. After the failure of their spring offensive in 1918, the Germans view the war as unwinnable. So American entry helps to determine which side wins the war. In political terms, the war and Wilson's worldview shaped the composition of the post-war political order in three important ways. The defeat of Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans meant the end of their multinational empires. In their wake, a series of new independent states emerged. Wilson hastened these political changes by championing self-determination or the right of subjected peoples or nationalities to create a new state or political unit. On one level, this was an imperial war that led to the end of multiple multinational empires. Wilson also erected a collective security system called the League of Nations, in which its members would pledge to band together and counter through force or economic sanctions any attempt to alter the new political and territorial status quo in Europe. Wilson was trying to construct a new international organization to solve the problem of war. In economic terms, the United States emerged from the war as the strongest economic power of the world. The victors had been borrowing significant amounts of capital from American banks and the US government to win the war. Moreover, these allies in Europe had also sold many of their foreign assets during the course of the war to pay for it. So industrial and agricultural capacity in the United States had been dramatically scaled up during the war because Europe needed someone to produce these goods. Large components of Europe's labor force was either dead or still engaged in battle throughout the war. And so this shift in economic power, both in terms of industrial and agricultural capacity and financial resources, would then enable the United States to shape subsequent efforts to alter the Versailles Treaty in the 1920s. So more broadly, the outcome of this war, U.S. entry into it, created a political and strategic opportunity for the United States that allowed it to shape the post-war order and begin to undermine the empires of the European powers.